Uh, Thanks very much to all the speakers who've made themselves available, and we do want to try and respect the time limits and obligations of people who are on screen with us. I'll introduce each speaker separately, and if you could keep your questions until the end after all of the speakers have spoken. And our first speaker tonight is Dr. Anna Walsh. She's a lawyer, bioethicist, and academic. She has a Doctor of Philosophy and Law on conscientious objection by doctors to abortion, and has got postgraduate degrees in law from the University of Sydney and bioethics from Harvard. She lectures full-time in the School of Law and Business at the University of Notre Dame in Health Law, and she's going to talk about the history of abortion in Australia over recent decades and the shaping of Australian attitudes to abortion. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you for inviting me to speak. It's quite the challenge to speak about this topic in 5 minutes, but I will do my best. I have a couple of slides which I'll just try to share. You could just give me a thumbs up if you can see those. Yes.
Yep.
Beautiful. Just something to look at other than my face. So I've got 7 points. Abortion law is very liberal in Australia. It's not very good, and there are further attacks on the way. But the first point to note is that we are a federation, so we've got the Commonwealth, and then we've got 6 states and 2 territories. And abortion has generally fallen within the province of criminal law as well as healthcare, and the Commonwealth is limited in its authority to legislate in those areas, so it's generally fallen to the states and territories to do that. So we do have 8 pieces of legislation across Australia and a handful of cases where judges at various levels have interpreted that legislation. My second point is that as a colony of England, we received English laws on settlement, and at the centre of English law to do with prenatal human life was the born alive rule, which stated that a human being is not a legal person until they are fully extruded from the womb, born alive, whether they're attached by the umbilical cord or not. And that reflected the reality of miscarriages and the limitation of technical knowledge and whatnot. But notwithstanding advances in that area, we've retained that born alive rule regarding legal personhood, and it allows the states and territories to make up their law between conception and birth as to the value and the legal status of the unborn child. My third point has to sort of do with this slide here. So criminal statutes were not particularly helpful. They defined an unlawful abortion as an abortion that was unlawful, and they therefore left it to judges in the courts to decide the definition of unlawful. They used the common law defence of necessity, and they adopted the law from the UK in relation to the life of the mother being extended to also her physical health. And there was a case in 1969 in Victoria that was also kind of copied in New South Wales a couple of years later, that said that an abortion was lawful if the doctor held an honest belief that abortion was a proportionate response to a grave concern for the woman's life. So it implicitly recognised that the reality that there was a child and that it had value, but not conferring legal personhood. If you look along here, you can see in 1981, the Queensland Supreme Court extended that concept of her life to include her mental health, but there was quite a stern warning from the judge that that should not be taken to mean a carte blanche for abortion. There's been a couple of prosecutions successfully for doctors in New South Wales committing unlawful abortions, usually involving a sort of a later term abortion. But they never revisited that threshold test for what a lawful abortion was. The problems with those cases for those doctors was that they didn't record their assessment of maternal concerns for her health. My fourth point is just in relation to this next slide here, which just sort of sets out a summary of the development of legislation in Australia. So South Australia was the first state in Australia back in 1969 to readjust the lens from that concept of maternal health concerns to the gestational age of the child, plus a few other conditions. So stricter conditions would apply to achieve an abortion the more developed the unborn child was. And as you can see over the next 50 years or so, gestational age has arguably become the most relevant factor in determining whether abortion is lawful, though there's a variation between the states and territories. as to what that level is for an abortion on demand. You can basically get an abortion up to birth. There are a few more conditions that need to be fulfilled, but between 16 and 24 weeks seems to be the number. So this schematic just illustrates the development of this gestational age ideology, which is a very worrying development because it cements in people's minds, obviously, that later term abortions are more bad because it looks like a baby, and earlier term abortions are okay because it's just a clump of cells or it's less viable, etc., etc. We've got surgical and medical abortion in Australia, and there's been a more recent expansion from doctors being able to do abortion to other registered health practitioners, such as registered nurses and midwives. You can see a few extra conditions here or there, mandatory counselling, some conditions for if a child is born alive, etc., etc. But that's the state of play. My fifth point is that in relation to conscientious objection, we don't have a Bill of Rights in Australia, which is kind of unusual geographically from where we are. We've signed or ratified the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which recognises freedom of conscience, thought and religion as a fundamental inviolable right, but we don't have it as binding law in Australia federally. So it's left to all the states and territories to work out what they think about that. And when it comes to abortion, each of the individual pieces of abortion legislation mentions something about it. But there has been an interesting development. So you can sort of see back in 2008, we had a Victorian model which required a mandatory referral, if you're a conscientious objector, to refer a woman on to a doctor that you know or believe does not have an objection to abortion. You also have to still perform abortion in an emergency, and that's relevant because it means that freedom of conscience is not unfettered in legislation. You still have to perform one in an emergency, although that's not been defined by the courts what that actually means. A failure to comply with the law could lead to disciplinary proceedings and whatnot. There has been a variation on this. So half the states in Australia copy that Victorian model, but the other half, and that's 4 jurisdictions, have a slightly different model where you still have to mandatorily refer, you still have to perform abortion in an emergency, but they have this concept of a third-party referral. So you can discharge your duty to refer by providing the patient with a pamphlet of a government organisation that doesn't perform abortions and purports to advise the patient on all options. And I think it's important just to note that once you've disclosed your objection, you provided that particular pamphlet, there's actually nothing legally stopping the doctor from consensually speaking with their patient about crisis pregnancy centres or continuing pregnancy in order to give birth. So out of the 2 models, that is the better one. So half the states have that, though currently in New South Wales, that is even under attack. They want to get rid of that and require doctors to make an effective referral, which is particularly problematic for Catholic health professionals because of the concept of cooperation in wrongdoing. They just wouldn't be able to do that. My last point is in relation to safe access zones or bubble zones around abortion clinics. All of our jurisdictions in Australia have this prohibition so that you can't perform certain actions, which can range from protesting, giving sidewalk counselling, and even in some states, communicating about abortion in a manner that might cause anxiety or distress to a person, not a reasonable person, just a person. And generally, the bubble zone is about 150 metres. And it's interestingly legislated as either a tack-on to their abortion legislation or alternatively as part of public health. And that's very worrying because if you make it part of public health, it actually changes the definition of health and harm. It kind of subverts that concept that you need epidemiological evidence that there is a risk to the community that is at such a high level that it should infract upon personal rights and freedoms. There was a High Court case here in 2019 that Paul Hanrahan knows a lot about that involved sidewalk counsellors, and unfortunately the applicant was unsuccessful. So they remain in situ. So that is in 5 minutes a summary of the history of abortion law in Australia. So we've moved from the criminal statutes, exceptions under maternal health concerns to this straight out gestational age model with a limitation on conscientious objection, plans afoot to destroy that even further, and safe access zones around abortion clinics. And I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. And if we can now put Dr. Elvis on the screen. Dr. Elvis Seman. He grew up in Broken Hill in New South Wales, of Croatian background, trained in obstetrics and gynecology in Australia and the UK. His great mentor was the co-founder of Mater Care, Professor Robert Wally, and Elvis is currently the medical director of Mater Care International and adjunct associate professor in the College of Medicine and Public Health at Flinders University. Thanks very much, Elvis.
And thank you. Chiara will share the PowerPoint.
There we are. Can everyone see that?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I'll have the next slide, please. So I would just like to present on this whole question of trends in abortion law from the perspective of a gynecologist. I don't have any topics of interest or acknowledgements. Next slide, please. And I would simply like to cover 5 points, and if there's time, include a conclusion. Next slide. So there are 3 major trends in abortion law in this new millennium. Firstly, legalising induced abortion to term, eliminating conscientious objection to it, both individual and organisational, and mandating referral to clinics which already accept self-referred patients. Next. The aims of initial and subsequent legislation, again, from my perspective, as a medico, the initial legislation, which, as we heard, began in South Australia in 1969, Millhouse, was to undermine any perceived Hippocratic barriers. And subsequent laws, beginning in Victoria 2007, aim to remove all remaining perceived barriers, including any remnants of good medical practice, including conscientious objection and mandatory referral for counselling. Next slide, please. This was achieved, has been achieved, very successfully with this concept of decriminalisation using the slogan, "Remove the stigma." Unfortunately, this has eliminated legal recognition that abortion is the killing of a human being in utero and thereby has dehumanised unborn babies. And once abortion was in the healthcare code, the killing of babies became healthcare. Abortion became a kind of good, and the sky was the limit in terms of gestation. And abortion has been decriminalised in every state and territory of Australia since March of last year. So it's a deceptive and highly effective strategy for advancing abortion. Next. Looking at the legal wording of these acts, there is intentional ambiguity and in particular blurring of the distinction between abortion and delivery, which are clinically and ethically at opposite poles. Abortion is defined as when a mother and baby is separated with the intention of producing a dead baby, and delivery is when separation occurs with the intention of producing a live baby. And when separation occurs for a genuine medical indication, for example, severe high blood pressure, all maternal benefit comes from the act of separation and none comes from the actual killing of the baby. Next. As a result, we have access to abortion, which is unencumbered for any or no reason to term, and this unlimited access has created an abortion utopia in Australia. Next. There has been a considerable impact on freedom of conscience and religion because the conscience clauses command varying degrees of cooperation with evil. And this has impacted profoundly on practicing Christians, Muslims, as well as healthcare professionals of all of goodwill. And anyone that's been involved in the abortion industry, whether advocating, referring, legislating, clerking, or even performing them, suffers a moral injury which leads to spiritual wounding. Next. What about health professionals' attitudes to abortion and its funding? Well, this is best summarised by looking at the AMA and my own college, the Royal Australian New Zealand College of O&G. These are totally and absolutely pro-abortion. The AMA also supported removing the right to practice according to conscience. They were involved in the drafting of a number of these clauses in the Act. And Ranscog sanitises baby killing by referring to it as abortion care, and sadly offers no alternative pathway for managing a crisis pregnancy, as advocated by the Hassans, who came up with a very successful model in New Zealand general practice. Next slide. What about chemical medication abortion? As Anna mentioned, there's been a legal push to widen prescriber eligibility and utilisation. And counterintuitively, it's strongly advocated to all women, despite it being more dangerous in terms of a high rate of complications such as hemorrhage, infection, incomplete abortion, need for surgical evacuation, and maternal death. And even more so in a rural setting where you just don't have the supports that are necessary. Next slide. Late-term abortion, that is 24 plus weeks, and feticide, which is a means of causing death in utero. Now, life-threatening conditions of the mother require urgent separation of mother and baby, and this is also referred to as pregnancy termination. Caesarean section can achieve this in half an hour, but abortion, late term, takes days. Feticide is absolutely unnecessary, as there is no additional maternal benefit from killing the baby. Now, there's a very important statistic from an American paper from 2004, which is that maternal mortality, the death rate from abortion, increases exponentially after 8 weeks by 38% per week, resulting in abortion beyond 20 weeks having a higher immediate mortality than vaginal or caesarean delivery of a live baby. And so this argument that, oh, look, you know, we need safe abortion, well, I'm sorry, this is where abortion becomes more dangerous for the mother. It's always dangerous for the baby, but beyond 20 weeks, it's very dangerous for mothers. And also, it's unfortunate that the evidence on fetal pain and its management are completely ignored. Next slide. And just a final comment about babies born alive after abortion. They are legally entitled to care only in South Australia, New South Wales and Queensland. Final slide. Look, thank you very much for your attention. I've tried to outline the trends in Australian abortion law from the perspective of a Catholic gynaecologist, and I'm happy to take questions later. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Elvis, for that very sobering presentation. Our next speaker is Paul Hanrahan. He's the Executive Director of Family Life International Australia. He's been married for 40 years to his wife, Christine. They've got 5 adult children. He's been the Sydney coordinator of the Helpers of God Precious Infants for 30 years and is a veteran pro-lifer. And tonight he's going to talk about the impact of the media and the diminished impact of the church as a voice in the public space. Paul?
Thank you. I've just got a talk. I haven't got slides. I don't know how I'd manage many slides on that issue, but I guess there's some. Thanks. All around the world, certainly the Western world, the mainstream media have proven to be hostile to tradition, religious, social, familial, certainly moral. In fact, without them, the greatest propaganda machine the world has ever seen, the decline in culture and religious and social mores would not have taken place, at least to anywhere near the extent it has. It's been so coordinated and orchestrated, it clearly hasn't happened by coincidence. In Australia, the media problem is exacerbated by the dominance of 2 very large groups controlling the media, News Corp and Nine Entertainment Company. Both of these include substantial shareholdings by international investment houses Vanguard and BlackRock. These seem to be the connection to the otherwise amazing consistency in news stories allowed to air around the world. None of this is surprising. It will be interesting to continue to see the Trump effect on this oligopoly as we go forward. The mainstream media certainly have done him no favours, except accidentally, of course. I could relay stories of my own engagement with mainstream media, but time doesn't allow that today. How we manage the pro-life, pro-family, pro-faith message within this zeitgeist is what we need to focus on. We always need to have at the forefront of our minds in all we do, we can do nothing without God. He himself said that. Therefore, Almighty God will not be outdone by mainstream media or the investment behemoths or politicians or anyone else. We need to trust that he's in control, that everything we do conforms to his holy will. In other words, compromise won't get us anywhere, nor will putting God and the church aside and try to win people over with arguments purely from reason. Don't get me wrong, arguments from reason based on science, especially biology, sound philosophy, especially ontological arguments, etc., are worth having but won't win people over morally. That goes to the heart and soul of a person, and many have been hurt in some way that's put them on this course against God. We need to know those arguments and overcome them. Only God will touch their hearts and heal them and bring them to conversion. What to do then? I think we need to go back to basics. Why do so many Catholics, let alone others, use abortifacient contraceptives? Why do so many Catholics either not know the Church's teaching on contraception or ignore it? Why do so many support, at least in some cases, abortion itself? I think we could get a strong hint if we understand that so many don't accept the real presence of our Lord Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. Many surveys have shown this, and numbers as high as 60% amongst Sunday Mass attendees even. Our problem isn't really the mainstream media, it is ourselves, in fact. A question we should ask ourselves often is, am I doing all I can do? I don't think too many are, and that isn't to say there aren't plenty of people doing a lot, but is it all they can do? That also doesn't mean we need to do something big. If that's what God wants, he'll make sure it happens if you're open to his will. We can and should be doing all we can do locally in our own communities, families and circles. I spent thousands of hours standing, praying and offering assistance to women, couples if the man was present, outside abortion mills. I've literally spoken to 6,000 to 7,000 people who engaged with me, not including those who brushed me off. There were many who identified as Catholic or Christian. The reason they most often gave for being there was there's no support. Almost every single woman told me she had no choice. Now, of course, in Australia, we can't be within 150 metres, 500 feet if you're in America, of an abortion mill, or we can be jailed for 12 months and fined $11,000. Yes, the media told many lies, and many were happy to believe them when these laws were being passed, and especially our politicians. However, if there'd been thousands of Catholics praying at these places for all the many years before these laws were implemented, it would not have happened. Instead, we would be lucky to have 5 to 10 people on there. On occasion, some major event like 40 Days for Life, opening or closing processions, there might be as many as 300. In Sydney, we were responsible for closing 3 abortion mills. That is with just those small numbers. Every single abortion mill would have been closed if everyone would do all they could do. In doing that, we were able to assist 600 plus women keep their babies. I still receive photos of these children growing up. Some needed a lot of help and others just needed to know it was there if they needed it. The early church didn't have any mainstream media outlets either, nor did they have a friendly cultural zeitgeist or politicians on side. They converted people one at a time, usually by being the best Christians they could be, by helping the widows and orphans, and by refusing to compromise their faith. That is what wins hearts and minds. That's what we need to implement, because we aren't going to ever control the media. We're never going to be able to influence that. We're never going to be able to change it. So apart from meetings like this and private social media forums, we're on the outer. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Paul, for that coalface experience. We now move to Dr. Eamonn Mathieson. Dr. Mathieson is a specialist anaesthetist working in private practice in Melbourne, Australia. He's an interest in bioethics and medico-legal issues and is National Chair of the Australian Catholic Medical Association. Eamonn's going to talk on the different religions and their approach to abortion, including the impact of Roe versus Wade, and possibly, if he has time, touch on the meta view of the sexual revolution. Thanks very much, Eamonn.
Can I share the screen, see if it works?
Yes, go for it.
I'm trying to share, but it looks like it's something strange is coming up. Opens it. Oh, damn.
You may need to log in again.
top.
Yeah. Should have tried it before I was asking the question. Do you want to go to the next one? I'll see it says quit and reopen. So it, I don't know. It had a share button, but it didn't seem to. I feel like I've got to share it because partly to sort of make the case because it's a fairly delicate and touchy subject. If I quit, I might drop out and come back in if that's okay, Cara. Do you want to go to the next speaker and I'll come back after?
Okay, that's fine. Thanks.
Because
Thanks, Amy.
because I quit and reopen, and I might leave you. It looks like and come back in because it's
All
not.
right. We'll just see if he comes back in. We'll give him a second. Kiara, do you have Eamonn's slides?
He has not sent them over yet, but I will send a reminder in the chat that he can close to me.
That'd be good. Well, we might, just to keep things moving along, I might move to our next speaker, my wife. I better introduce her properly. Okay, Mary Clare is a former registered nurse specialising in intensive care nursing. She's been very proactive in pro-life and family issues around the country for a number of decades. My own background is in science education and bioethics, and I was formerly the director of the Life, Marriage and Family Centre for the Archdiocese of Sydney. We've got 9 children and 7 going on 9 grandchildren. And we were the founders of the National Association of Catholic Families here in Australia. Mary Clare. You need to demute yourself, darling.
Done. Okay. The vast majority, can you hear me?
Yes.
The vast majority of pro-life activists are Catholics in Australia. Our regular mass attendance rate in the last census was about 8.2%. And of these, about 2/3 who go to mass regularly once or more a week believe that abortion should be illegal. We do appear to be witnessing a resurgence in the Catholic faith of young adults between 18 and 29 years. Numbers practicing their faith has doubled in the last 9 years. They now comprise 12% of all Sunday mass goers. So this brings us some hope for the pro-life movement in Australia. Probably the biggest area of concern is Catholic education, and almost 1/5 of all Australian schools are Catholic. Too many teachers are in the vanguard of dissent. Now, I'll just move on to counselling services. Pregnancy Help Australia was set up to bring together various small counselling and pregnancy assistance groups across Australia. Each group retains its own services but receive advice and help from Pregnancy Help Australia. Some groups have chosen to remain independent. I've spoken to a number of women working closely in pregnancy help centres, and these are a few of their concerns and suggestions. Women presenting for the chemical abortion pills regime are not informed of side effects such as extreme pain, vomiting, and seeing the aborted baby. The latter is the most disturbing for women. The effect of abortion on men is often overlooked. Some who phone a counselling line are very distressed to have lost their child. They have no say in the abortion decision. It's possible parishes or communities could provide mentorship and spiritual support to assist them to embrace fatherhood. One pregnancy help centre has been singled out as an ideal. Pregnancy Help Perth in Western Australia. It has the commitment to integrate a prayer team during the opening hours for consultations with ongoing intercession of parishes before the Blessed Sacrament. Pregnancy Help Perth also has its own chapel, and visiting priests make it unique in its own right. It could be a priority that a large part of the budget from donations be spent in advertising the presence of crisis pregnancy services. Pro-lifers need to be as professional, as sleek as the opposition. Good resources, advertising in major transport hubs, churches, Christian properties and locations would be effective. Also, the beautiful revival of the choice for adoption should be presented as a loving option once again. Support groups like Pregnancy Help Australia, Abortion Pill Reversal, Australian Christian Lobby, Family Voice, News Weekly, Family Life International and Helpers of God's Precious Infants could do with more support, both practically and financially. We also could organise large numbers to counter the weakness of so many of our politicians, which is what we are trying to do. Public pro-life marches through the city are critical in a time when public debate is being shut down and freedoms are being eroded, but their witness cannot be underestimated. Pro-lifers have materials on health warnings, answers for women in crisis, access to Catholic Christian healthcare, and a sophisticated framework to share resources, plus a lot of wisdom. The challenge is to create and advance communication by every means available. Parishes can be upskilled in knowledge and awareness so that they can be the hands and feet and mind of Christ in supporting each new life, whatever the circumstances. Most of all, we need courage, despite the ongoing censorship of our rights. The Church's role is critical. It needs to renew its strength as a community of people in reinvigorating Christian civilization once again. So it is in and through the Church that we need to grow in grace and increase in numbers if we want to win this battle. Few lay people are sufficiently, or lay faithful, I should say, are sufficiently formed in Catholic doctrine, bioethics, or sexual morality, and this needs to be the foremost in the minds of clergy when they preach. We need to hear more about these issues from the pulpit. It does not have to be a fire and brimstone approach, but nor does there need to be a code of silence for the sake of the vulnerable in the congregation. We need to find ways and means to turn the tide on pornography, which today is vastly widespread, an addiction that is often the root of the demonic rage against chastity and all its consequences. A proliferation of resources for the family would also be helpful so that we can raise children with Christian principles of sexuality. A force of reparation should be called for by the Church. It is necessary. By this reparation and intercession, the faithful give witness to others, petition God's mercy, and build about us a strong barrier to the flood of evil ideologies and sin that contaminates so many. During prayers of the faithful recited at Sunday Mass, one of the petitions could or should be for, quote, the safety of all unborn babies. This would offend no one. Essential to the strengthening of the body of Christ, the faithful need to be more often encouraged to attend regularly the sacrament of confession. And this would further reduce the many sacrilegious communions that occur in many parishes. In conclusion, in his pastoral letter to women, St. John Paul II appealed to the feminine genius to force systems to be redesigned in a way which favours humanisation, which marks the civilisation of love. We need to find innovative ways to switch the culture to the truth that motherhood is to be celebrated, honoured and cherished. A mother's love, fortitude, sacrifice and courage forms the beating heart of our society. It is through women and ultimately the family that we will succeed in eradicating abortion. Even a small remnant armed with truth, courageous in witness, can succeed in embedding in the consciences of families the extraordinary gift of the family, and that it is they that establishes and uphold the true value of each person born into it, of invaluable worth, irreplaceable, unrepeatable and uniquely precious. We will one day, with God's grace, make abortion unnecessary, unthinkable, and eventually illegal.
Thank you, Mary Claire. And if we could perhaps move back to Dr. Eamonn, you might like to pick up on where you were before you had to drop off screen, Adrian.
I can share because it looked like I had to ask permission. Yeah, looks like I can share now. So you don't have to go through the thing. Here we go. Sorry about this. Oh, I had it up there a moment ago. There we go. All right. Can I move this out of the way? So yeah, it was a last minute decision as to present on this particular subject. It's a huge subject. 5-6 minutes is not going to do it justice, but I wanted to point out a couple of things that I think, just in terms of my own attempt to understand the roots of what we're dealing with, and how difficult it is, in a sense, to understand how there can be a position that is so anti-life, and who are our where this is all coming from in some ways. And I was very surprised. Can people see that first screen?
Yes, that's fine.
Yes.
No.
Okay. I'll go through it very quickly, and it's really just to express my great concern. I've been involved in sort of trying to oppose the abortion legislation probably since before 2008 in Victoria. We were the sort of first ones, I think, to lead the way on the coercion of conscience in particular. And my interest is quite wide-ranging, and I think this is the stuff we kind of do need to grapple with, especially from the academies such as this, what the theological, philosophical, cultural, political, and ideological underpinnings of abortion are, where it comes from, what are the ideas that support it, and how it's sustained. I think we really deeply have to reflect upon these issues, particularly in the societies we live at the moment. And the issues I think that it brings forth, particularly it brings into focus the concepts of religious freedom, the competing moralities, the tyranny of relativism, as Pope Benedict said. And in that situation, whoever dominates, I suppose, ends up imposing their views and their, beliefs onto others. And it comes down to this issue. This is what's quite interesting. It's happening at the moment in both in Australia, but also in the US. And my focus is mostly going to be on what the US, which basically leads a lot of what happens around the world, I think, culturally. And I think Paul mentioned a few of those influences in terms of media and also the organizations. So just on the coercion of conscience, and this is really my question. Does religion inform morality on abortion? Should we really be grappling with the deeper grammar of the abortion debate, and where this is coming from? So the two areas, the Australian thing is the abortion laws in Victoria in 2008 and the current one in 2025 in New South Wales. But for me, a great revelation happened to me of trying to work with different groups, other Christian groups and Muslim groups and Jewish groups over the last 20 years or so. I was kind of astonished after Roe versus Wade was overturned, and the reaction that happened locally here, even in Catholic hospitals, but then through the media and what I became aware of, which kind of shocked me to the core. And it's a very difficult issue to address. But so these are just the two legislations. This is the New South Wales one, just for your interest. And just to highlight that this is the coercion of the Christian, Catholic, believing doctors and healthcare workers and facilities into the abortion sort of industry. And this is why there was a protest outside of Parliament in Sydney and New South Wales against this legislation that's being introduced. About 5,000 people turned up to that. There's great concern about coercion, but it's almost 20 years since Victoria introduced a similar law, and it's actually worse. And Anna did mention it, just so you can see it. It's still on the books here. It says, despite, going down to the bottom there, number 3, despite any, I'll go to the next one. It's actually easy to read. Despite any conscientious objection to abortion, doctors are under a duty to perform an abortion in an emergency, and also to refer a woman that the practitioner knows, not even believes. I think they've gone back to the word believes, but this is knows. It's an absurdity. And the nurses were even worse. They had a duty to assist. They had no say whatsoever. They couldn't refer onto another person, and it didn't even need to be in that abortion setting. So that's the nature of it. And I think our position, we understand it very clearly about the concept of why we are against it. And I think Mary said that so many people who are pro-life tend to be coming from a Catholic background or a conservative Christian background. And I think it all rests on our understanding of anthropology of the human person and based on the Imago Dei. And one would think that would be shared with, many other communities. And so when looking at the religious perspective, that which has influence, particularly in the Anglophone world, it's really a Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish. And I think it's the Jewish influence in our culture and in these ideas that we as Catholics don't really understand. And I've tried discussing this with other colleagues of mine, and who are very unfamiliar with the differences and often think that there's a significant alignment where there doesn't seem to be. And I think it raises a great deal of questions, contentious issues. So the response, the focus just for these 5 minutes, I've probably almost run out of that time. I should have had the clock on. was just to show the response that came out of the US in 2021 when Roe versus Wade was overturned. And this is all clips from Jewish media. So I found it quite extraordinary that they were seeing abortion access as a Jewish value. This is across the board, except for probably one exception of the ultra-Orthodox that did in publicly state that they welcomed, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I've gone through hundreds and hundreds of representative organizations that disagreed with Dobbs, that hundreds of local federations. This is just flicking through. A painful and distressing day for many Americans and Jewish students, informed by their beliefs and values. And this is the really important thing that I found really quite extraordinary. There was no dissenting position on this as far as I could find, as I said, except for the one exception I'll bring to. That if this is the case, it's quite astonishing to me. I was really quite rocked by this. And what I think is also interesting is that one cannot really raise these issues in the current climate, which I also find fascinating in terms of the sort of media culture and the culture in which we live, in the sort of self-censoring and the ability of Catholics to sort of see the chasm between these two faiths, which I think has a lot of implications. So this was, a delicate subject, clearly. I told a couple of my colleagues I was going to talk on this subject very briefly. They said, "What, in 5 minutes?" They said it was like a suicide pact. But I think it's important to at least address, and these are all the public statements that hasn't changed about Roe versus Wade and the position. And what I think is more interesting is these are all the representative, very large organizations. This is the exception. They said they welcomed the Agudath, who represents some ultra-Orthodox groups. But still, that was their only thing that they published. What I think is really important in this notion of coercion and legislation is the understanding that it's not just a choice, that it is required. And once it becomes required, that becomes part of a religion whereby if any of the legislation that you introduce to reduce that is an attack on the freedom of religion of the vast majority, 90+%, according to the statistics from their own Jewish organizations, believe this to be an attack on their religious freedom, which is the absolute opposite of what we understand of things from a Catholic perspective about coercion, religious freedom, etc., etc. And this is backed up with, I'm just going through it. And this is where it comes down to it. And there's multiple cases going through the US at the moment, led by the organizations saying that, like that sign said, abortion bans are against our religion. So, as I mentioned, 5 states at the moment are going through this, where cases are being brought. This is the Kentucky case, which is interesting. This notion about how these things are now put into law. A fetus does not become a human being or a child until birth. Under no circumstances has Jewish law defined a human being or child as the moment of humans, sperm with the ovum. The question of when life begins for a human being is a religious and philosophical question. And the question that the perspective that community has is very different to a Catholic perspective. So that's
thanks very much, Eamonn. Thank you. Sorry to draw you off there, but it's a very deep and rich topic, and certainly the Jewish perspective has been influential in jurisprudence in the Anglosphere, at least. And they have a very different.
And I think they're the questions that it kind of raises for me, and I think it's something that Catholics do need to address and have a look at. As difficult as it is. Thank you.
And we now move to our final speaker, Father Pascal. He's a priest of the Order of Friars Minor Conventual. He's got a doctorate, as well as being a medical doctor. He's got a doctorate from the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Marriage and the Family, and he currently lectures in moral theology and bioethics at the University of Notre Dame. Father Pascal.
Thanks, Chris. I probably should note that I was a student of the John Paul Institute in Rome before the current incarnation of it. I've been asked to talk about how we might create a culture in which abortion becomes both unnecessary and unthinkable. And of course, immediately coming to mind is the challenge which Pope St. John Paul II put to us in the Evangelium Vitae and throughout his pontificate of creating a culture of life. And of course, in creating such a culture of life, there are many challenges before us, immediate challenges as well as long-term. In terms of the immediate challenge we face, I suppose two immediately come to mind. We've already talked about, the legal, political situation which we face in the Western world, in our Australian context. And most certainly that is something which we have to be very mindful of, and as committed pro-lifers need to be involved in. Personally, I don't hold much hope, at least within the political landscape of our Australian context, of actually being able to provide any containment of abortion as it is. And nonetheless, I mean, we don't give up. We must continue to try. And another immediate concern is really the pastoral care of women who are contemplating an abortion. And in this, I think, we need, as a church, as people of life, we need to be thinking broadly, especially in the context of what Paul has said, where, curbside counselling now is sort of essentially not only restricted, but probably impossible to do. We need to be able to somehow sort of get to women who are contemplating abortion, women who are in unplanned pregnancy. And that immediate challenge, pastoral challenge of caring for them, I think should take again a cue from our Holy Patron, who in his book, Crossing the Threshold of Hope, insisted that the abortion debate needs to become courageously pro-women, promoting real choice that is truly in favour of life. So, and it really stems from the realisation that as in our care for the unborn, it's really, our care can only be extended through her. But it's only the mother who directly nurtures her unborn child. And all the rest of us can do is to nurture her, care for her. And therefore, again, as St. John Paul wrote, it's precisely the woman who pays the highest price, not only for her motherhood, but even for, paying the price of having that life within her suppressed and destroyed. And therefore, it is in loving her, in supporting her, that we can care for her child. And as you see in many of the pro-life rallies, these days, must love. But it's really the long-term goals, I think, that we need to be focused on, of creating a culture that will make abortion unnecessary, unthinkable. And that, I believe, requires education and it requires evangelization. And in this, of course, we're going well beyond the question of abortion itself. With regard to abortion, we need to encourage women and men to tell their stories of their experience of abortion and their grief and their hurt and their regret. Here in our Australian context, we had journalists like Melinda Tankard-Rice who have paved a way for such conversations, but I think they really need to be encouraged and to continue. And I think in that the church has a very important role to bring abortion and real experiences of it into the consciousness of the public, which would give witness to the lie, first of all, of choice within the abortion movement, but would also foster the possibility of healing and reconciliation for those who still hold on to that. And as a priest, one of the most, touching, painful, but nonetheless consoling experiences is in the confessional, when women and men come confessing their experience, their involvement in abortion, and hearing their pain, their tears, but also sensing that real sense of relief when they receive that absolution, that healing. And in that we have to follow St. Paul's maxim. We have to speak the truth of the reality of abortion, but to speak it in love. And therefore that becomes, I think, our way of speaking words of comfort and mercy to those who have been affected. Again, Pope John Paul II reflected on this in his in Evangelium Vitae, when he spoke specifically about and speaking specifically to women who have suffered from abortion, and also spoke of the need for them to be witnesses of a new culture of life, to be at the forefront of a new culture, and of promoting a new feminism which rejects the temptation of imitating models of male domination, in order to affirm the true genius of women, which Mary Clare's already spoken about, especially in that feminine capacity to accept others, in their intuition of the needs of others, in their capacity to try. But I think at the same time we need to challenge men to step up. For too long, men have hidden behind that convenient mantra that abortion is a women's issue, that it's her right to choose, and therefore use it as a way of avoiding responsibility for their actions and furthering their own selfish agenda. In that context, quote the words of a dear late friend of some of us here, of Professor Nicholas Tontifilippini, who said that abortion would be much less frequent if men were more respectful of a woman's capacity for motherhood, and included that possibility in their thinking about her, and subsequently being willing to support her in the event of pregnancy. That's precisely the separation of sexual intimacy from reproduction has done great harm to women, because the significance of motherhood has all but been excluded from our cultural understanding of sexuality, which of course was something which Pope St. Paul VI prophetically spoke about in the Meney. But again, I think in the long-term goal, this creation of a cultural life goes beyond the question of abortion itself. And it really requires a constant and effective and faithful proclamation of a witness into the new life which is ours in our Saviour. The type of witness which was offered by the early church in the midst of a real culture of death, and also of the missionaries of our past who brought the saving truth of God to cultures which were far away from him. And that means, in the first place, proclaiming God as our Lord and as our Creator, as the giver of our human nature and the logic of that nature. And it's no coincidence that the increasing attacks against life, the culture of death, occurs within the culture that has turned its back towards God. And again, St. John Paul II often this point repeatedly, that the heart of the tragedy being experienced by modern man is due to the eclipse of the sense of God, typical of a social and cultural climate dominated by secularism, with which its ubiquitous tentacle succeeds in putting Christian communities themselves to the test. Because he says, when God is lost, there is also a tendency to lose a sense of man, of his dignity and of his life. And in turn, that systematic violation of the moral law, especially in serious matters of respect for human life and dignity, produces a kind of progressive darkening of our capacity to hear God's law and his living and saving presence. Accordingly, therefore, I think the challenge before us is essentially a religious one of the eclipse of God, and therefore of the need to proclaim him and his sovereignty over life. And if we appear to be losing this battle in the culture which surrounds us, Well, it's evidence of, first, the forces of evil at large in our secular society, which we must never underestimate. But I think it's also sadly reflective of the fact that the church has lacked courageous witnesses to the truth, which of course is not helped in our current situation of lack of clarity of teaching, which we need to be at the forefront of promoting. And so faithfulness, holiness, and love for humanity to be able to courageously proclaim the gospel of Christ. That becomes a timeless and true path for creating a culture of life in which abortion would be unthinkable and unnecessary.
Thanks very much, Father Pascal. That's a very good point to finish on. Look, we're sort of reached the end of our time, but I might just, before we conclude, invite any of the people on screen who have not had an opportunity to speak, if they have questions that they'd like to raise with any of the speakers. There's a few people who are there who may have a question they wish to raise. Just raise your hand or hit the... Liam's got a question, I think. Liam? I think you're on mute. I think you're still on. Yeah, that's.
He's unmuted, but it's still not coming.
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thanks, Chris. Fantastic presentations all around. I have a quick question for Anna regarding the born alive rule. About 20 years ago, I understand that the Australian courts were moving away from a strict understanding of the born alive rule as identifying the personhood of the unborn child. In cases, I think it was King and Eby, or Eby, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. It seems to have come to a halt. I'm just wondering, was there any particular legacy of those decisions that could be exploited and further give recognition to the humanity of the unborn child, even apart from the issue of abortion?
Yeah, those cases were quite interesting in around 2006, I think they were, Aaron King and Aaron Ibby. They had very much to do with third-party assaults, so assaults on pregnant women or vehicular manslaughter from someone who was quite heavily pregnant. I think the problem with those cases, which set a very minimal standard for when someone is born alive, just simply having taken a breath, is that there were exceptions carved out. So you'd have people wanting to put forward laws like Zoe's law, which said that the fetus can be the victim of a crime, but only if they are more than 400 grams in weight or greater than 20 weeks in gestation. And the people who were proposing those laws, you know, mothers who had lost their children, would always say in the media, but I don't want to impact upon the right to have an abortion. So they themselves were confused in wanting to keep that as an exception. So it wasn't exploited in that way. But now they have everything they want, really. People who are for abortion, they've still got everything they want, but they're still wanting more. So there wasn't any further like appeals or emphasis on those rulings by the court because they were just sort of seen as third-party assaults as opposed to a second-party assault, which is what an abortion is.
Thanks for that.
Do we have any other questions from others on the screen? Okay, well, look, I haven't said anything particular, but before we move to the final prayer, I just wanted to read something. I wanted to finish on an upbeat note, if you like, and many would know I'm a great admirer of Cardinal George Pell, but in an address that he gave to the Newman Society at Oxford University, he talked a little bit about the importance of Catholicism and the culture. And, quote, speaking as a Catholic leader, I'd like to state my claim set out in our basic position in this ancient, now secular university founded from even older monasteries. We Catholics are here to stay in England and in my country of Australia and on every continent. Popes come and go with different gifts and strengths, but the papacy is still in Rome, the ancient capital of empire, home of the successor of Peter and bishop of that eternal city. The roar that you hear is not the melancholy sound of a once mighty kingdom departing into oblivion. It is the roar of the Lion of Judah, embattled in many parts, humiliated and often reduced in the Western world, but absolutely devoted to its precious tradition received from Christ and the apostles, and deeply convinced of the life-giving power of this inheritance, even in the most poisonous environments. The gospel Protestants, the evangelicals, will be with us in these mighty battles. We are here to stay and to struggle. We are not going away. I think it's a good sort of thing to remember that Christ has already conquered, and we just have to make sure that we can stay the course. So thank you to everyone for coming, and we might just close now. My particular thanks too to Chiara for all the work she's done behind the scenes to make it all happen. But we might finish with a closing prayer, Father Pascal.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Amen. We pray to St. Michael. Michael the Archangel, defend us in the day of battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl throughout the world, seeking the ruin of souls.